Nothing in the room suggested that a stranger eating alone was about to change dozens of lives in seconds. And I was 3 meters away when it all started. I worked at Burger King for almost 6 years, and by that point, the job had turned into background noise in my life, something I could do without thinking too much. I knew the regulars, I knew the sound of every machine, and I knew exactly how long fries needed before customers started complaining. That afternoon started like any other shift, with families coming in after school and workers stopping by before heading home, and I moved between the counter and the kitchen without paying attention to anything beyond orders and receipts. Then a young man walked in alone and ordered a double cheeseburger combo with medium fries and a Coke. His voice was steady enough that I didn't look at him twice. He paid in cash and took his tray without hesitation, then chose a booth facing the rest of the dining area instead of the window, which I only remember because it feels important in hindsight. He ate slowly and without distractions, and after he finished, he didn't leave or check his phone like most customers would. Instead, he sat there with his hands on the table and his eyes moving from one group to another, studying people in a way that felt deliberate once I noticed it. I caught myself watching him from behind the counter while pretending to clean, because something about how still he sat started to make me uneasy, even though I couldn't explain why. After about 20 minutes of sitting there, he pushed his chair back with a loud scrape against the floor, and several customers glanced in his direction as he stood up and reached into the pocket of his hoodie. There was a brief moment where his hand stayed inside his hoodie longer than it should have, and the pause made me focus on him more closely than before. I was holding a stack of cups at the counter when he pulled out a handgun and raised it in front of him at chest level, and the sight of it felt unreal in that bright, cheap restaurant lighting. The first shot exploded through the dining area and hit an older man who had been reading alone, and his chair flipped backward as he fell hard onto the tile. The second shot struck a woman who had just stood up from her table, and she collapsed against a chair while her children screamed and tried to shake her awake. People started running in different directions at once, knocking over trays and slipping on spilled drinks, and he kept firing with controlled movements as if he'd already decided who to aim at next. A teenage girl tried to sprint toward the door, but a bullet hit her leg and she crashed to the floor, grabbing at her thigh while crying for help. I dropped behind the counter and crawled toward the back hallway, keeping my head low as more shots rang out and echoed off the walls. As I moved, a sharp impact tore across my upper arm, and when I looked down, I saw blood spreading through my sleeve, where a bullet had grazed me and ripped through skin without going any deeper. The pain was hot and immediate, and panic hit me harder than the wound itself because I didn't know whether the next shot would land somewhere worse. I pressed my hand against my arm and kept crawling, because staying near the counter meant I could be seen again at any second. I reached the storage room behind the kitchen and shut the door, then shoved a heavy metal rack against it while trying to stay quiet, despite the chaos outside. Gunshots continued in the dining area, followed by screams and the sound of bodies hitting the floor, and each noise made it clear that he was still moving through the room. Footsteps entered the hallway and stopped right outside the storage room, and the door handle moved slowly before rattling harder against the frame. The metal rack scraped across the floor as he pushed from the other side, and I dropped flat to the ground as a bullet blasted through the door and sent splinters flying past my head. He fired again, lower this time, and the shot tore through boxes stacked near the shelves, sending paper cups spilling all around me. I could hear his breathing through the door, steady and controlled. After a few long seconds, the footsteps moved away, and I stayed on the floor while dialing 911 with one hand and pressing the other against my bleeding arm. I forced myself to speak clearly to the operator while another shot echoed from the dining area, followed by a scream that cut off so suddenly that the silence afterward felt heavy and wrong. The sirens grew louder outside, and officers shouted commands from the entrance, telling him to drop the weapon and get on the ground. There was a pause that stretched painfully long, and then several rapid shots rang out, different from his gun, signaling that police had engaged him. I remained in the storage room until an officer pounded on the door and identified himself. And when I stepped back into the dining area, the sight in front of me felt disconnected from the place I'd worked in for years. Tables were overturned. Drinks and food were scattered across the floor, and several people lay motionless while paramedics rushed in. They had him pinned near the entrance with his hands forced behind his back, and 3 officers pressed him down while another secured the cuffs. He didn't fight or scream, and he didn't look confused or panicked, which made his calm expression feel almost more violent than the gun itself. Then a woman knelt on the floor holding her daughter while paramedics tried to intervene, and she kept shouting through tears that she could barely control. "Why? Why? Why?" As officers lifted him to his feet and guided him toward the door, he turned his head to look directly at her, and his face showed no anger or regret.
"I was just bored."
He said it clearly and without hesitation, and that simple answer seemed to hit the room harder than the gunshots had. At the hospital, doctors cleaned and stitched my arm while detectives waited outside the room to ask me what I'd seen, and I answered every question in detail because I wanted to make sure nothing was misunderstood. They told me I was lucky that the bullet had only grazed me, although that word felt hollow after seeing how many others had not been spared. 3 people died that afternoon, and several others were left in critical condition, including the woman's daughter, whose face I'd just seen minutes earlier while she ate quietly at the corner table. News crews surrounded the building for days, and the footage replayed on television over and over, forcing everyone involved to relive the beginning of the attack. Detectives kept asking if he had seemed unstable or angry before he started shooting, and I had to repeat that he looked normal, which frustrated them because there was no dramatic warning sign to point at. The truth was that he finished his meal, stood up, and chose violence in a room full of strangers. When management called to ask if I would return once the store reopened, I declined immediately because I knew I would never be able to stand behind that counter again without watching every customer's hands. In 2000, a man entered a Burger King in Pennsylvania armed with a gun and began shooting without warning at customers and staff, causing a horrible massacre. Before the police arrested him, the attacker carried out shootings at other fast food restaurants.
They convinced my manager that I was a criminal, and he decided to treat me like one without checking anything first. I was 19 and working the late shift at a Burger King near the highway, trying to save money. That night had been slow, and I was wiping down tables while counting the minutes until closing time. I never would have imagined that I would end it tied to the floor of the office. Carl, my manager, stayed in the back office doing paperwork as usual. He was strict and careful with numbers, always worried about audits and complaints. When the store phone rang, he answered without hesitation, but his posture changed within seconds. He stood up straighter and stopped blinking as much, like someone had just handed him a problem that could ruin him. He called me into the office and locked the door behind me, which immediately made my chest tighten. He put the call on speaker so I could hear the man on the other end. The voice said he was a police officer investigating a theft and that I had been identified as the suspect. The caller explained that officers were busy and that Carl needed to detain and search me until they arrived. He described the register I had used and claimed there was evidence I had taken money. I told Carl this had to be a prank and that he should hang up and call the police station directly. Instead, he stared at the desk while listening to the man describe consequences for non-compliance. The caller warned him that failing to cooperate could result in charges against management. Carl told me to empty my pockets, and I did it to prove this was ridiculous. I placed my phone, keys, and cash on the desk and turned my pockets inside out. The caller then said suspects often hide items in clothing and that a full search was required. I refused and told Carl this was insane, but the caller shifted the pressure. He mentioned an internal audit from months earlier and referred to missing money from the store safe. giving a date and amount that made Carl freeze. I saw fear move across his face in a way I had never seen before. After that moment, Carl stopped questioning the instructions. He told me that if this was real and he ignored it, he could lose his job and possibly face charges himself. His voice was tight and uneven as he ordered me to remove my apron and shoes. The air in that small office felt heavier once Carl decided to follow through. The ventilation hummed above us while the caller continued giving step-by-step directions. Carl told me to remove my shirt and pants so he could inspect them properly. I argued and told him he was making a serious mistake, but he slapped me hard enough to make my head turn. He said I was forcing his hand and that I needed to cooperate if I had nothing to hide. The caller backed him up, saying resistance was a sign of guilt. There was a long pause before the next instruction, and Carl stood still as if waiting for permission. The caller then said partial compliance was not enough and that a complete search was necessary. Carl told me to remove everything, and when I hesitated again, he shoved me against the filing cabinet and repeated the order. I complied because I was alone in a locked room with a man who had already crossed a line. Carl inspected every part of my body while the caller described what to check. He acted like this was procedure, not humiliation, and that made it worse. Another silence settled in before the caller told him to restrain me to prevent escape. Carl opened a drawer and took out plastic zip ties used for deliveries. He forced my wrists behind the metal chair and tightened the plastic until it bit into my skin and made my fingers tingle. Time stopped feeling normal once I was tied down. Carl placed the phone on speaker and stepped back while the caller continued explaining what to do next. The voice described how suspects might still be hiding items and how control needed to be maintained. Before acting again, Carl stood still and listened closely, breathing unevenly. The caller reminded him that failing to follow instructions could expose the missing safe money to upper management. That reminder seemed to push him forward every time he hesitated. When I started yelling, Carl shoved a towel into my mouth and wrapped duct tape around my head to hold it in place. The tape pulled at my hair and tightened whenever I tried to move my jaw. He punched me in the stomach twice while repeating that he had no choice. There was another pause before the caller instructed him to apply discipline if I continued resisting. Carl grabbed a wooden ruler from his desk and struck my thighs repeatedly, counting each hit as if it turned the act into something official. I could not move away, and every attempt to shift only made the zip ties cut deeper. He tightened the restraints again when I tried to twist my wrists free. He kept asking where the money was and why I was lying, even though I had never taken anything. The caller's calm voice continued reinforcing every action, telling him he was handling the situation correctly. By midnight, Carl looked drained but committed to the path he had chosen. The caller lowered his voice and said, "Suspects often break under pressure, but only if that pressure is consistent." Carl paced the office once and then returned to me with a stiff, determined look. Before the next instruction, there was a silence that felt deliberate, as if the caller wanted him to sit with his fear. Carl asked again when officers would arrive, and the caller said they were on their way but needed full cooperation. That answer was enough to keep him moving. Carl cut the ties at my ankles, only to drag me off the chair and onto the floor. He retied my wrists to a metal pipe under the desk, pulling them back at an angle that made my shoulders ache. When I tried to lift my head, he pushed it down against the tile and told me to stop fighting. The caller instructed him to maintain physical dominance to prevent further resistance. Carl placed his foot against my upper back to keep me from shifting while he continued questioning me. Each denial made him press harder, as if he could force a confession out of pain. He struck my thigh again with the ruler and demanded to know where the stolen money was hidden. His voice was no longer calm, and he sounded desperate to prove he was doing the right thing. The caller remained steady, guiding him through every step like this was routine. The pattern finally broke when a delivery driver walked in through the unlocked front door. He heard noise from the back and called out for Carl, who quickly stepped out of the office to intercept him. I could hear their conversation turn tense within seconds. The driver pushed past Carl and opened the office door despite his protests. When he saw me tied and injured on the floor, he pulled out his phone immediately. Carl tried to explain that this was a police matter, but the driver ignored him and dialed 911. Carl grabbed his own phone and attempted to call the number back, but it went straight to a generic voicemail with no department name. His face changed when he realized he had been taking orders from a stranger. The voice that had controlled the night was gone. Real officers arrived quickly and cut the restraints. They took photos and separated us for questioning. Carl kept insisting he was following instructions from law enforcement, but the officers told him no agency had made that call. At the hospital, I gave a full statement about everything that happened, from the first phone call to the final strike. Investigators later explained that similar scams had occurred at other fast food restaurants, using the same method of authority and fear. The caller relied on managers who were afraid of losing their jobs. Carl was arrested and charged for what he did because being manipulated did not excuse hours of restraint and assault. The scammer was never identified, and that fact still unsettles me more than anything else. It means the voice could still be out there, dialing another store. I quit that job and never returned. What stays with me is how easily everything escalated from a single phone call. There were no weapons and no masks, only instructions and fear. That is what makes it hard to forget, because it proves that under enough pressure, ordinary people can become the ones you need to escape from.
If you think a crowded Burger King is a safe place for a kid, you're wrong. I worked there long enough to know how noise can hide things, and that Saturday proved it in the worst way. It was Children's Day, which meant balloons taped to walls, paper crowns everywhere, and a play area packed with kids climbing over each other while parents filmed everything. I was assigned to move between the counter and the play zone because management expected chaos and needed someone to keep an eye on it. The kitchen was running non-stop. Fryers loud, grills full, orders stacking on the screen. Even with all of that going on, I noticed when the king walked in. The full costume looked official, crown shining under the lights, red robe dragging slightly behind him. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Then I realized nobody had told us a mascot was coming. He stayed near the play structure and avoided the counter area completely, which was strange because mascots usually interact with parents for pictures and attention. This one did not pose, did not exaggerate movements, and did not approach adults. He stood close to the kids and tilted his head in a way that made me uncomfortable, as if he was studying them instead of entertaining them. I tried to confirm with Mark, our manager, but he was busy dealing with deliveries and barely listened when I mentioned the costume. He shrugged and said maybe corporate arranged it, which sounded unlikely, but possible enough that I returned to work. Still, I kept watching the king whenever I had a clear line of sight. About 15 minutes later, a father pushed through the line at the counter with panic already written across his face. He said his son had been inside the play tubes, had waved at the king, and then vanished. He demanded to know where the mascot had gone. Mark responded that we had not hired anyone to wear the costume, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that had filled the restaurant all afternoon. Once the words left Mark's mouth, the mood changed fast. Parents started calling their kids' names louder, some climbing into the play structure themselves, others rushing toward the exits. The father was breathing hard, explaining that his son had been right there minutes ago and would not wander off alone. When it became clear that no family had hired the mascot either, fear replaced confusion. We locked the doors so no one could leave, which caused more shouting, but the father insisted it was necessary. I was told to check the bathrooms and back rooms while others searched the play area piece by piece. As I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, the noise from the front seemed distant compared to the hum of equipment behind me. The back exit alarm light was not blinking the way it should have been, and that detail made it obvious this was not random. Someone had turned it off. Before opening the dry storage room, I stood still and listened carefully because I needed to know if I was about to face an empty room or something worse. That was when I heard a faint knocking sound that did not match any machine. It came from inside the storage area, irregular and weak. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, noticing boxes moved from their usual spots in a clear path toward the industrial oven at the back. The knocking happened again, and this time I knew exactly where it came from. I approached the oven knowing how dangerous it could be, even if it was currently off, and I forced myself to move carefully instead of panicking. The door was shut tight, and when I pressed my ear against it, I heard shallow breathing along with another soft knock from the inside. I pulled the handle with both hands and opened the heavy door. The missing boy was curled on the metal rack, wrists tied with plastic cable ties and mouth sealed with tape. His face was red from crying, and he looked at me as if he was not sure whether I was safe either. I lifted him out and placed him on the floor so I could free his hands, telling him quietly that he was going to be okay, even though I was not sure what would happen next. That was when the storage door slammed shut behind me with enough force to shake the shelves. I turned around slowly and saw the king standing in front of the only exit, holding a metal spatula taken from the grill station. His posture was no longer playful, and the mask's fixed smile looked wrong under the dim storage light. He took a step forward and spoke in a low voice that sounded strained inside the mask.
You were not supposed to look back here.
The boy started crying louder on the floor, and I moved slightly to block him with my body, even though I knew I was not strong enough to stop a determined adult. The man tightened his grip on the spatula and advanced without hesitation. He swung the metal tool toward my head, and I shifted to the side just in time, but the edge scraped across my shoulder and sent pain through my arm. I stumbled backward into the oven door, trying to keep my balance while he reached for the boy again. I pushed him hard in the chest, which slowed him for a second, but did not stop him. He slammed me against the metal shelf, causing boxes and cans to fall all around us, and then drove his elbow into my side with enough force to make it hard to breathe. He raised the spatula again and pressed it toward my face while I held his wrist with both hands, straining to keep the metal away from my eyes. He muttered that we had ruined everything and that no one would have noticed until it was too late, which made it clear he had planned to walk out quietly. I grabbed a loose package from the floor and threw it at his head, then tackled him at the waist, and we crashed into the shelving unit together. He fought back aggressively, twisting and striking wherever he could, and I realized I was not winning, only delaying him. The boy's crying grew louder, echoing in the small room, and the man tried to push past me again, desperate now rather than calm. That was when the storage door handle rattled from the outside. The door burst open and Mark and two parents rushed in after hearing the noise. The father saw his son on the floor and immediately threw himself at the man in the costume, knocking him sideways and sending the spatula sliding across the floor. The attacker struggled violently, swinging his arms and trying to break free, but Mark grabbed his leg while another parent pinned his shoulder down. The father punched the plastic mask until it cracked and fell off, revealing a thin man with wild eyes who screamed in frustration when he realized he could not escape. I crawled to the boy and removed the tape from his mouth carefully, then cut the plastic ties with a small knife from the prep table. He clung to his father as soon as he was free, shaking and crying openly. Police arrived minutes later and dragged the man out in handcuffs while the restaurant remained locked and filled with terrified families. Officers later confirmed he had walked in wearing the costume without anyone questioning him, using the crowd as cover. I finished that shift with a bruised shoulder and a clear understanding that noise can hide more than people think. The restaurant reopened after a few days, but the play area stayed empty for weeks because parents no longer trusted the space. The boy survived physically, but the image of him inside that oven has never left me. I left the job not long after. Now when I see the king's smiling face on advertisements, I do not see a harmless mascot. I see how easily someone can hide in plain sight when everyone assumes someone else is responsible.